In the summer of 1969, a mechanic named Dale Armstrong walked into a junkyard outside of Bakersfield, California. He was looking for a cheap small block Chevy to drop into his buddy's drag car. What he found instead was a mystery that would consume the next 3 years of his life. The engine in question looked ordinary, beat up actually, covered in grime, missing half its accessories, sitting on a pallet next to a stack of rusted transmissions. But when Dale wiped the casting number clean, he stopped cold. The number didn't match anything in his Chevrolet parts book. And Dale had memorized that book. This is the story of the small block Chevy and the secret war fought in garages and machine shops across America. A war where the weapons were casting numbers, the battlefield was the local drag strip, and the spoils went to whoever could find, identify, and hide the factory's best-kept secrets. Along the way, we'll encounter engine builders who became legends, racers who became detectives, and a corporate parts department that had no idea what it had created. So let's begin. But first, how did a simple V8 engine become the most analyzed, cataloged, and obsessively studied piece of machinery in automotive history? The small block Chevy arrived in 1955, and honestly, it changed everything. Before that year, Chevrolet was your grandfather's car. Reliable, sure. Affordable, absolutely. But exciting? Not even close. The brand had spent decades building its reputation on sensible transportation for sensible people. Then the engineers in Detroit dropped a 265 cubic inch V8 into the new Bel Air, and suddenly Chevrolet wasn't boring anymore. Now, I should mention something important here. The small block wasn't revolutionary because of raw power. It made 162 horsepower in base form, which was respectable, but hardly earth-shattering. What made it special was how it was built. The block was compact, lightweight, and designed with manufacturing efficiency in mind. The heads used a clever valve arrangement that improved breathing. The whole package weighed hundreds of pounds less than comparable Ford and Chrysler V8s. But here's the thing about manufacturing efficiency. When you're stamping out thousands of engines per day, small variations creep in. Different casting batches, different machine tolerances, different suppliers for seemingly identical parts. Chevrolet's quality control caught the obvious problems, but the subtle differences, those slipped through. And some of those differences, as racers would eventually discover, made certain engines significantly better than others. See, Chevrolet didn't build one small block. They built dozens of variations over the years. Different displacements, different bore sizes, different head configurations. The 265 became the 283, which became the 327, which became the 350. Each change brought new castings, new part numbers, new opportunities for the sharp-eyed to find an edge. The racing community figured this out faster than Chevrolet did. By the early 1960s, serious drag racers were spending as much time in parts warehouses as they were at the track. They'd buy blocks by the pallet, measure every critical dimension, and keep detailed records of what they found. Most blocks were average, some were garbage, but every once in a while someone would find a casting that measured just a little tighter, held compression just a little better, or distributed oil just a little more efficiently. I mention this because this is where the secrets began. The guys who found the good castings didn't advertise their discoveries. They hoarded them. They memorized the identifying marks, kept the part numbers to themselves, and told anyone who asked that they'd gotten lucky with a stock rebuild. The first real underground knowledge network formed around cylinder heads. This makes sense when you think about it. The heads are where air and fuel mix, where combustion happens, where power is made or lost. A head that flows just 5% more air can mean the difference between winning and watching someone else take the trophy. Chevrolet released several head castings throughout the 1960s, each identified by a code cast into the metal. The casual observer saw random numbers. The initiated saw a roadmap. Certain castings, it turned out, came from specific foundries during specific production runs, and some foundries, whether through better sand, tighter quality control, or pure luck, consistently produced heads that outperformed their siblings. The 461 casting became legendary among drag racers. These heads, produced primarily between 1964 and 1967, featured combustion chambers that measured remarkably consistent from cylinder to cylinder. Most production heads varied by several cubic centimeters. The 461s often varied by less than 1. That kind of consistency meant predictable compression ratios, which meant more precise tuning, which meant faster quarter-mile times. But here's where it gets interesting. Chevrolet produced millions of cylinder heads. The 461 casting number covered a range of production dates, multiple foundries, and countless individual variations. Not all 461 heads were created equal. The racers who dug deepest discovered that casting numbers were only the beginning of the story. Date codes told you when a head was cast. Foundry marks told you where. Machining marks told you which shift, which equipment, sometimes which individual worker had finished the part. The truly obsessive built databases cross-referencing performance results with every identifying mark they could find. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain date ranges from certain foundries consistently produced superior parts. Okay, I realize I've been talking about heads for a while. Let's get back to the blocks, because that's where the real secrets lived. A cylinder block is the foundation of any engine. It holds the crankshaft, guides the pistons, contains the cooling passages, and routes oil to every moving part. In a racing application, the block also has to survive tremendous forces, combustion pressures trying to crack it, thermal cycling trying to warp it, vibration trying to shake it apart. Chevrolet's small block was designed for durability in normal use. But racing isn't normal use. Drag racing, in particular, subjects an engine to stresses that no factory engineer anticipated. Full throttle launches, sustained high RPM, repeated heat cycles with minimal warm-up. Under these conditions, the small variations between castings became critical. The racers learned to look for specific characteristics: wall thickness between cylinders, the consistency of the main bearing webbing, the quality of the deck surface where the heads bolted on. Some blocks measured thick and true. Others were thin in critical areas, prone to cracking under boost or nitrous. Now, Chevrolet did eventually recognize that some of their parts were better than others. In 1969, they introduced the Z28 option package for the Camaro, which included a specially selected 302 cubic inch engine built for Trans Am racing. The blocks and heads in these engines weren't fundamentally different from regular production parts. They were just the cream of the crop, pulled from the assembly line and set aside for the performance application. The existence of the Z28 program confirmed what racers had suspected for years. Chevrolet knew their parts varied. They just didn't publicize which variations were best. Why would they? Telling customers that some engines were better than others would only create headaches. So the knowledge stayed underground, passed from racer to racer, hoarded by those who had it, sought by those who didn't. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of stuff. Quick question, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And hey, subscribe if you haven't. We do this every week. All right, back to the secrets. Because this is where the real cat-and-mouse game began. By the early 1970s, the underground casting knowledge had created a two-tier racing world. The guys who knew which parts to look for consistently outperformed those who didn't. But the informed racers faced a problem. If they showed up at the track with obviously special equipment, their competitors would start asking questions. Word would spread. The advantage would disappear. So they learned to hide. The simplest method was paint. Factory small blocks came in Chevrolet orange, a distinctive shade that everyone recognized. A racer running a carefully selected high-performance casting would spray it the same orange, sometimes adding artificial grease and grime to make it look like a tired stockyard pull. The engine that looked like it belonged in a farm truck would proceed to run circles around the competition. Part numbers posed a trickier problem. Every major casting had identifying codes visible on its surface. A knowledgeable competitor could glance at your engine and immediately know what you were running. The solution? Grinding. Careful application of a die grinder could remove casting numbers without obviously damaging the part. Some racers went further, using metal filler and careful paintwork to create fake numbers, making a rare high-performance casting look like a common passenger car part. The truly paranoid developed even more elaborate deceptions. They'd install obviously inferior parts on top of their secret components. A mediocre carburetor hiding a carefully ported intake manifold. A stock-looking air cleaner concealing a high-flow filter. They'd deliberately misidentify their equipment in tech inspection, knowing that most inspectors wouldn't dig deep enough to discover the truth. And it worked. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, certain racers developed reputations as miracle workers. Their engines made power that the math said shouldn't be possible. Competitors would tear down their own equipment looking for the secret, never finding it, because the secret wasn't in the assembly, it was in the selection. Dale Armstrong, the mechanic from the opening of this story, eventually traced his mystery block to a small batch produced in late 1967. The casting had been an experiment, a prototype for a high-performance version that never reached production. Somehow, a handful of these blocks had escaped the factory and ended up in the parts distribution system, mixed in with regular production units. Dale spent 6 months tracking down every example he could find. He bought 15 blocks total, paying junkyard prices for what he recognized as prototype equipment. When he finally started building engines with these castings, the results were remarkable. The blocks held compression better, survived higher boost levels, and tolerated more aggressive tuning than anything else in his shop. Did he tell anyone? Of course not. He became known as one of the best engine builders in Southern California, but his clients never knew exactly why his engines were so consistent. He took the casting numbers to his grave. The knowledge networks of this era operated almost like spy rings, informal, decentralized, built on personal relationships and mutual trust. A racer who discovered a good casting might share the information with his close circle, maybe 4 or 5 trusted friends. Those friends might each share with their own circles. The information spread but slowly, and always with the understanding that it went no further. Certain machine shops became known as repositories of casting knowledge. The owners had spent years building databases, measuring thousands of parts, recording every correlation between identifying marks and actual performance. They guarded this information jealously, sharing it only with paying customers who could be trusted to keep quiet. I love this part of the story, honestly. These guys were basically running intelligence operations. They had informants in Chevrolet's parts warehouses, people who would tip them off when interesting castings arrived. They maintained surveillance on their competitors, photographing equipment at races, trying to identify which secret parts their rivals were using. Some even resorted to industrial espionage, bribing employees at other machine shops for access to their databases. The stakes were real. A top fuel dragster in the early 1970s could earn its owner $50,000 a year in prize money and sponsorships. That's maybe $300,000 in today's money. The difference between a good season and a great season often came down to finding parts that gave you an edge. When that much money was on the line, people got creative. The paint deceptions reached their peak sophistication around 1973. By then, several professional race teams had hired full-time specialists whose only job was disguising equipment. These weren't mechanics, they were artists. They could take a block that had been extensively modified with port work and deck surfacing and careful blueprinting and make it look completely stock. Not just stock, beat-up stock, used stock. the kind of engine that looked like it had been pulled from a taxicab at 100,000 miles. The inspectors at sanctioning bodies tried to keep up, but they were outgunned. A thorough inspection of a small block Chevy could take hours. At a typical weekend race, there might be 50 or 60 cars entered. The math didn't work. Inspectors learned to spot the obvious cheaters, but the subtle ones, the guys with the genuine rare castings disguised as common parts, they slipped through almost every time. There was a famous incident at the 1975 NHRA Winter Nationals. A racer from Texas showed up with what appeared to be a completely stock 350 in his Camaro. The car was entered in a class for lightly modified production vehicles, where the rules limited modifications to basic bolt-on parts. The Texas car proceeded to run times that were physically impossible with the allowed equipment. The tech inspectors tore the engine down twice, looking for hidden modifications. They found nothing. The carburetor was stock. The intake was stock. The heads were, as far as anyone could tell, ordinary passenger car castings. Yet the engine made nearly 50 more horsepower than identical setups on the dyno. The answer came out years later. The racer had spent 2 years finding cylinder heads from a specific production run at a specific foundry. These heads, through some quirk of manufacturing, had combustion chambers that were several cubic centimeters smaller than specification. That smaller chamber raised the compression ratio by nearly a full point. More compression meant more power, without any modifications that would show up in inspection. The officials never figured it out. The racer collected his trophy and went home. The story entered the underground canon, passed from racer to racer as proof that knowledge was power. Now I should mention that not everyone cheated. Many racers competed honestly, running equipment that was exactly what it appeared to be. They often lost to the guys with the secrets, but they kept racing anyway. The culture of the time accepted a certain amount of gamesmanship. Finding better parts wasn't really cheating. It was research. The manufacturers eventually caught on to what was happening. By the mid-1970s, Chevrolet had started taking steps to reduce variation in their castings, better quality control, more consistent foundry practices, tighter tolerances at the machine shops. The special batches became harder to find, and the advantage they conferred began to shrink. But the knowledge never disappeared. It evolved. As the old small block gave way to newer designs, the obsessives transferred their methods to the new platforms. They measured, cataloged, tested, and hoarded. The specific casting numbers changed, but the game remained the same. What of the people involved in this story? Most have passed on, taking their secrets with them, the databases they built, the notes they kept,